Welcome, everyone, to the Week 13 NFL Preview Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We are both of the 33rd team, and we are both going to be recapping the Week 12 action with an eye towards those Week 13 matchups. Ryan, why don't you kick us off with the Thursday night game for this upcoming week?
Yeah, we got a decent one here, Josh. Cowboys versus Seahawks. Cowboys are now 8.5-point favorites. They've already jumped from 7-point favorites in less than 24 hours. Game total's 46.5, which means sports books don't exactly see this as a shootout or low-scoring affair. They're kind of hedging their bets a little bit here. For Dallas, they've been absolutely destroying mediocre teams. That's usually a good sign. It's something I keep track of every year. They're leading the league in that asset right now. Dak Prescott's been in MVP play for about a month now. I bet on him at 40-1. 3 or 4 weeks ago. Statistically, he's right there at the top. And, after last week's throttling of the Commanders in front of a national audience, now he's in the top 4 amongst the contenders. What are you thinking about the Cowboys offense and the team in general here, Josh?
Yeah, Dak Prescott, this whole offense has been surging. Since week 6, Dak Prescott has more fantasy points than every single other quarterback in fantasy football. Even ahead of Jalen Hurts, Prescott's averaged 28 fantasy points per game in the past month and a half. When we look at this matchup, Seattle's defense has generally struggled against running backs for fantasy. Since we kind of know who these teams are now that there's been 12 weeks of action, I created just a quick schedule-adjusted fantasy points metric. Seattle is 6th best for fantasy running backs, and I think Tony Pollard's in for a good game. The usage has been pretty good. He's just been inefficient. And a lot of that was when you looked at the advanced metrics, he wasn't forcing missed tackles. He wasn't breaking tackles. The last few weeks, that tide has started to turn. So he's had the high workload. And I think part of it might have been that a player like him just had to take some time to get adjusted to the bigger workload. And that as he's further removed from that tightrope ankle surgery, just the explosiveness is coming back. And then one last note, Brandon Cooks continues to be a player that we can flex, if not wide receiver 3 fantasy usage type for fantasy football. We talked about that last week and how he was in for a big game against the Commanders. This matchup against the Seahawks qualifies, and his next few matchups look quite good as well.
That's JLarky Tweets. You can find his fantasy rankings on the website on Tuesday afternoon, the33rdteam.com. The other side of this game, Josh, the Seahawks. Seahawks fans have been killing me with my power rankings for weeks. Oh, you're not high enough on them. You're not high enough on them. Turns out I knew what I was doing. Offense has been bad for, we're talking 6-7 weeks now. It's a Geno Smith problem to me. The defense is good. Josh, when we were bullish on the Seahawks this offseason, the worst case scenario was happening with the offense with Geno Smith. This was our one and only concern. I think they could still beat their win total, but our loftier prospects here, I think, are dead. I don't think, and if coming out of the NFC is off the table now. Defense is good. Offense is not. You have any hope for that changing this week?
No, I don't. I think for fantasy purposes, Zach Charbonnet was an absolute bell cow against the Niners and didn't quite crack 10 PPR fantasy points. I think more of that can be in store. The guy had 47 snaps, 14 carries, 4 targets. DJ Dallas only had 3 total touches in this one. So Charbonnet got pretty much all the work and it just didn't matter. I think that's the case this week. And if we just look at fantasy points per game, the offense has been atrocious. Geno, the quarterback, 25. Metcalf, the wide receiver, 30. Lockett, wide receiver, 34. Jackson Smith and Jigba, the wide receiver, 63. I don't think anything good is on the horizon in this matchup.
Let's run through the buys this week, Josh. Real quick. Bills, next week's game against the Eagles is Exhibit A for why I don't treat DVOA as a religion. Solid tool, but, I think they had the Eagles as like an 80, based on the stats in that game, is an 86% likely winner in there.
Yeah.
Not for me. If Buffalo gets into the tournament, they're going to be dangerous, but, they're on life support there now. Bears, Vikings, we'll see them tonight. I think the Bears are a little better than people think they are. Giants defense has been good for most of the year. They've now ruined their draft position with two wins in 2 weeks. Not a whole lot of hope there, but, they're not dead in the NFC wildcard race, which is kind of insane to even think about. Antonio Pierce, you got to give him a lot of credit with what he's done with the Raiders. Gave the Chiefs a game, gave the Dolphins a game. They're on their bye too. And lastly, Josh, to quote Moneyball here, if he's a good hitter, why doesn't he hit good? Lamar Jackson, if he's such a great passer, why doesn't he pass for more yards? I've been saying this all year. Been unpopular opinion in some ways, but, you guys all got to see him in prime time, and Lamar Jackson's a great player. But let's just, he's not as great of a passer as people think he is. Next up, Josh, Commanders versus Dolphins. Commanders are 9.5-point favorites or underdogs right now. Moved from 9 points overnight. 50.5 game total, which I believe is the highest on the slate. With Washington, Sam Howell's basically carried this team to any success they've had so far this season. I don't really, losing in Dallas isn't a big demerit for a team like Washington to me. What do you think about him in this matchup?
Yeah, I think he's poised for another big game. Sam Howell at this point, he's either going to get it done just with pure volume or with through his legs. He's had at least 18 fantasy points in 10 of his 12 games this year. One thing that I thought was interesting is that he's pacing for over 4,700 passing yards. He's pacing for 26 passing touchdowns. Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson, all outside the top 36 receivers in fantasy points per game. Out of these 12 games, if we look at games with 15 or more fantasy points, which is kind of what you're hoping for when you start a receiver in PPR, out of 12 games, McLaurin's done it 4 times. Curtis Samuel, 3. Jahan Dotson, twice. Jamison Crowder did it once. It's basically impossible to trust anyone in this pass attack. You're really just starting Sam Howell and Brian Robinson at this point.
Be sure to check out Jordan Vannick's DFS player pool later this week. He loves Mike McDaniel. He loves the Dolphins offense. So do all of us, but Jordan really, truly does. Defense continues to improve in Miami. I think that's great for their long-term prospects, makes them more dangerous in playoffs. Tua had a few bad throws against the Jets that led to interceptions, but in this particular matchup, Miami can absolutely destroy Washington's secondary. We saw Dak blow him up last week. What are you thinking here, Josh?
Yeah, Washington is, when you adjust for schedules, the best fantasy matchup for quarterbacks, for receivers. We just saw Tyreek and Waddle fill out 2 of the 6 100-yard performances against the Jets this year. They did that this past week, and I think I'd be pretty surprised if we're not seeing 250 to 300 receiving yards at least from that duo in this one. Tua is going to be a high-end fantasy quarterback one. At this point, the Commanders were already a defense to target, and then they lost their 2 edge rushers via trade. So I don't really know what they're trying to do right now. They just fired their defensive coordinator. I'd say at this point, it's all bad news. The one thing I'm looking at is the running back room. Raheem Mostert's been a revelation. He's in his 30s. He's still producing for fantasy. He still looks pretty good in real life. I'm very confident he's scoring fantasy points this weekend. We'll see if Devon Achane returns. I think he probably does. And if he does, I think I'd be inclined to think it's Mostert and Achane getting there in fantasy. If Achane sits, I will be flexing Jeff Wilson in this one. There's simply too many paths for the Dolphins to put up 5, 6, 7 touchdowns in this one.
With a bunch of games left, Josh, I have a question for you. Is the Commanders' defense, their pass defense in particular, this year's Vikings pass defense from last year?
I think that's good parallel. Yeah. I think at this point, auxiliary players can be started just due to touchdown upside and breaking a big play upside. And that's why I think should Achane miss, we can just flex Jeff Wilson.
I like it. Texans versus Broncos, a sneaky, excellent game. On opening day, Josh, we wouldn't have thought this would have been one of the best games on a slate, but here we are. Texans are 3.5-point home favorites. They've moved up from -3 in the last 24 hours. Game total here is 46 points. Stroud took a few really bad sacks in yesterday's game. In one instance, I think it was 2nd and 27, and they converted, on 3rd down. So he's able to make up that kind of margins. Guys cool as can be under fire. He had a deep shot to Tank Dell that was negated by a penalty too. That means in both games against the Jaguars this year, he hooked up with Dell for 50+ yards on a play. One thing I want to frame here too, Josh, is Devin Singletary had most of his receiving yards on one play. I think his box score is a little inflated, more inflated than his production would indicate. What are you thinking about the Texans offense here, Josh?
Yeah, let's focus a little bit actually on the Devin Singletary, Dameon Pierce split. While Singletary's receiving yardage total was inflated, the actual usage was not what we expected. We thought it would kind of be like a 1A, 1B situation. It was very much workhorse Devin Singletary. He outsnapped Dameon Pierce 47-11. While he only outcarried him 6-5, they just weren't running against the Jaguars. The Jaguars have been a pass defense to target, a run defense to avoid. So even though the carries were 6-5, 2 of those carries for Singletary were in the red zone, and 2 of them were at the goal line. All 5 of Pierce's carries were between the 20s. And when we look at routes run, 34 routes run for Singletary, just 5 for Pierce. We should not be starting Dameon Pierce at all, regardless of matchup at this point. And every single week, we should be considering Devin Singletary at least as a fantasy RB2. And I mean, in this matchup, worst run defense in the NFL with the Broncos. I will certainly be queuing up Devin Singletary.
Yeah, with Denver, that's a good segue for what I want to say here, Josh. The Broncos in the first month of the season, their defense was just. I think I ranked them 11th overall going into the season. I was like, oh my god, I don't think I've ever been this wrong about something ever, and I couldn't figure out why. And that stance has aged well because they've been excellent since. They're a big reason why the Broncos are now in the playoff hunt. But here's the thing, Josh, against Cleveland's defense, no less. I actually think, at least at the start of the game, that was the best start the Broncos offense has had all year. Russell Wilson looked great. The running game was effective early. That's a great sign for their long-term prospects. Is there anything from your end that's trending in that direction too?
Yeah, I think one thing to be aware of is that Javonte Williams is probably in for a nice bounce back. 18 carries, 3 of them in the red zone, 6 targets, which was a 29% target share in this contest. Somehow, with 18 carries and a 29% target share, he only mustered 10 fantasy points. The concern would just be that Samaje Perine had both goal line carries in this matchup. And in terms of bench stashes, we can just drop Jaleel McLaughlin. He took 2 snaps. He had 2 carries. He had 4 rushing yards. That was it. Samaje Perine was the goal line back, and he ran nearly as many routes as Javonte Williams. So I have no good notes to say about the pass attack for fantasy. While it might look good in real life, it's simply too low volume at this point for us to trust Sutton and Judy. But Javonte Williams, the clear fantasy RB2 or better, depending on matchup. And then Samaje Perine looks like the rest of season bench stash.
Be sure to check out Josh's rest of season rankings on Wednesday. It sounds like it's going to be the last installment of that series for the season. Next up, Josh, Saints versus Lions. Saints are 4-point home underdogs. Game total here is 45.5. I'm going to start with this, Josh. If you're clamoring for Jameis Winston to take over at quarterback, please watch his game as a Saint against the Panthers last year. There's a reason he hasn't been elevated. That's why New Orleans isn't in a hurry to start him. That's why they gave Andy Dalton the starting nod for the second half of the season. Derek Carr is what he is, but he's not going to kill you with turnovers. And the problem with the Saints offense here is that they don't finish drives. Been a problem all year. You have any positive things to say about the Saints offense, Josh?
I honestly don't have too many positives. I think this week they could be in for a world of pain. Chris Olave is concussed. Rashid Shaheed had a thigh injury. We might be looking at Taysom Hill, Juwan Johnson, and A.T. Perry leading this receiving core. That's not what you want to keep pace with a team like the Detroit Lions. I think the one positive, I guess, is that Alvin Kamara could have 35 fantasy points just based on usage in this one, where he gets 10, 15 targets like we've seen a couple times this year. But other than that, I actually think the Lions can, especially after getting embarrassed on Thanksgiving against the Packers. Personally, we'll see if you agree. I think the Lions steamroll them here.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say about the Lions is they're a good but not quite great team. They're another team where I've been below consensus on them for months and get yelled at every week. Honestly, the Bears beat them up worse than the Packers did. But the Bears had a meltdown defensively in the last 2 minutes. 2 kind of borderline concerning games, but they're against divisional opponents at least. Detroit's defense has been a defense that smokes below average offenses, but they've gotten, anyone who's decent, they don't really perform well against. I do think this is a correction spot. The Saints have no interest in winning the NFC South either. So I'm not really expecting like a big, breakthrough performance out of them, like the Lions in a bounce back spot. What do you think about their offense though here, Josh?
The one thing that was interesting to me was the Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery split. I understand game script was in favor of a pass catching back like Jahmyr Gibbs, but still 54 snaps for Gibbs, just 22 for Montgomery. While Gibbs had 11 carries, Montgomery did have more. He did have 15. He did have more red zone carries. Montgomery did score the touchdown. When we look at routes, 41-7 in Gibbs's favor. Targets were 8-1 in Gibbs's favor. I think this week we could see a shift in usage because I don't think the Saints can keep pace. But I think it's worth noting that week after week now, it seems like Montgomery's kind of the thumper now that Gibbs is up to speed, and that Gibbs, despite having fewer fantasy points last week, is the guy to prefer rest of season. And if you're flipping a coin, he should be the guy that you're starting over Montgomery. But I'd say at this point, Gibbs is a fantasy RB1 and Montgomery's still a high-end fantasy RB2 type where this offense really flows through Gibbs, Montgomery, and then Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah, I mean, they have all the tools in the world, and they have an easy schedule down the stretch too. But we'll see how you handle all these guys in your rest of season rankings. Steelers versus Cardinals. Spreads here, Steelers are 5.5-point home favorites. That's down a little bit from -6 over the last 24 hours. 39.5-point game total. Not much improvement on the scoreboard, but the the departure from Matt Canada last week. But the running game looked good. Najee Harris, if Najee Harris was a third-round pick, I don't think people would hate him as much as they do. But since he's a first-round pick, he is a bit of a, he's not a plus athlete. But, had a really good game as a grinder last week. Pat Freiermuth had a big game. What's more encouraging for me is there were certain games in the past where Matt Canada's offense threw no passes in the seam. I haven't looked at the passing charts yet, but that's definitely wasn't the case this week. You have any optimism for Pittsburgh going forward, Josh?
I do. Kenny Pickett, season high 278 passing yards in this game. The overall offense had over 400 total yards. They had never done that under Matt Canada. So that's at least encouraging. While they might not have been finishing drives with authority, the fact that they just had more raw yardage is good for real NFL football. And of course, it's good for fantasy points if they're sustaining drives, if they're actually matriculating the ball downfield. So I thought that was a positive. Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, the committee was a true 50-50 this past week. So some of the people out there, like you said, if they were like, oh, with Matt Canada gone, it's going to be all Jalen Warren. Not so fast. I think Najee Harris is here to stay. He has the first-round draft capital. He's good in that between the 20s grinder role where he's going to be also the preferred goal line back most of the time as well. And we'll discuss Pat Freiermuth more tomorrow on the Waiver Wire show. But you cannot dislike 11 targets and 9 for 120 receiving after he only played about a third of the snaps last week, returning from injury.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about that. I'm also going to add, we talked about this in the offseason. Najee Harris, Jalen Warren is Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard 2.0, essentially. Would you agree with that? Yeah, I would. And I think in this matchup, we can actually just start both. Cardinals are the second best running back matchup. Steelers, pretty big favorites. It would not surprise me if both of them hit 15 fantasy points in week 13. I know a big decision for me this week. Will I take the Steelers over the Cardinals in my core survivor pool where I could make a pretty good chunk of change? Arizona does not have a very, very good roster. The Rams offense lit them up early and often last week. This team's extremely dependent on Kyler Murray, he's been fine to this point. He's had some flashes of brilliance because he's a dynamic athlete for the position, but they have not been a consistent offense. You have any hope that changes in the near future, Josh? I'm still not quite sure. I haven't seen enough to think better days are ahead. For fantasy, a little bit disappointed with James Conner. I understand they got blown out, but if we just look at the first half when the game was still in reach, first half carries, 5 for James Conner, 3 for Amari DiMercato. That's not what you want to see. Conner was running 8 routes in the passing game in that first half. Michael Carter ran 2. Conner's being siphoned a little bit on both ends is what I'm saying, where he's getting siphoned a little bit in the run game, a little bit in the pass game. And this type of offense and this type of athlete with Conner, you really need him to get all the touches. The one thing that we talked about that I think finally came to fruition is that Marquise Brown had the big game. I'm not going to give ourselves credit because it is now 2 bad games and 1 good game. The one trend that stuck, though, is that they're putting him in this extreme downfield role. All 3 games that he's played with Kyler Murray now, his average depth of target has been at least 16 yards. He's more DFS viable than a good fantasy start right now. And it's kind of like last year's Christian Watson role is what they're putting Marquise Brown in since Kyler's return. So we talked about it last week. I'm hoping for a little more creativity. I'm hoping for some more short area targets for Marquise Brown rather than just having him running down the field and then hoping that Kyler Murray, who to his detriment has been inconsistent throughout his career with those type of plays, that's just not what you want for fantasy. Agreed. Jets versus Falcons. Speaking of not wanting things for fantasy, Jets 4-point home underdogs. Game total here is a blistering 34 points. The Jets are in quite a conundrum here where Nathaniel Hackett's a big part of the problem on offense, but since they brought him in for Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers is, probably not going to play until next year, they're kind of stuck with him. And this team looks like the wheels are about to fall off the bus here after another bad loss to Miami. Again, I don't know why Tim Boyle's starting quarterback in the NFL right now, but that's the way it is. Is there any even sliver of hope for anyone here, Josh? Well, it's certainly not in the passing game. I think the one area is it's going to be Breece Hall for fantasy football. Because people out there will be like, oh, did you know that he's averaging 30 rushing yards a game at 2.6 yards per carry since week 6? And I would say, yes, I know that. This whole run game is broken. Fortunately for Breece Hall, the target volume has been massive. He just had 9 targets with Tim Boyle this past week. And at this point, he's averaged 5 receptions and 44 receiving yards per game the past month and a half.
So he's really been the one player benefiting from just the league's worst passing offense by quite a bit at this point.
I'm going to double down on my Tim Tebow take, Josh. I would rather the Jets sign Tim Tebow and turn their offense this week into 4 tush pushes every play to see if you can get 10 yards on 4 of them up and down the field. I think it would be more effective than what they're doing right now. Speaking of doing things that are more effective, Josh, it turns out featuring Bijan Robinson in your offense in both phases is a pretty positive thing for the Falcons offense. That said, Josh, to the quarterback, I've never been crazy about Desmond Ridder as a passer. The one game he played in college against NFL prospects, he was not very good. That said, one thing he needs to do is he needs to run more. If he becomes a primary read, then check or run quarterback, I think the offense is going to be better. I wonder if we're going to see more of that as the season progresses. What do you got on the Falcons offense, Josh?
I thought it was interesting the run pass selection this past week, and I think it's going to be more of the same, where the Jets have absolutely locked down receivers. They've shut down quarterbacks. I have zero faith in Desmond Ridder, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, any pieces of this pass attack. What I do have some faith in, though, is the run game. Last week, they passed just 21 times, 34 running back rush attempts, and then Ridder even ran 7 times himself. So essentially twice as many plays that involved a run than a pass. It was pretty effective. I think we're going to see the exact same game plan this week against the Jets. And Bijan Robinson's usage was pretty incredible. To get 16 carries and 6 targets, that's exactly what we should be seeing every single week. If you're not giving Bijan at least 20 opportunities week in and week out, then I don't know why you spent the 8th pick on him. I think Bijan Robinson fantasy managers should once again be pretty happy this week, because I don't see how you score points against the Jets unless you're funneling your entire offense through him.
Yeah, Desmond Ridder against that Jets secondary, especially assuming they're going to be angry off a long week, does not sound like fun. Buccaneers versus Panthers, Josh. Buccaneers are 5-point home favorites right now. Moved down from 6 despite Frank Wright and a few other coaches being fired today. Game total here is 37.5 points. Nothing's really changed for me much on the Bucs offense, Josh. It's pretty much the same thing. It's the Baker Mayfield show for the most point. However, Rachaad White had a good game, but I am going to say a lot of it came on one play on the ground. Not really a sustainable play either. So, like Rachaad White more than I did before the season started, but I'm going to throw that caveat in there. What do you got on the Bucs, Josh?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that Rachaad White and Mike Evans are the 2 players who start each week, and then Baker Mayfield is just kind of matchup dependent. Chris Godwin is he's kind of a moderate volume, low depth of target slot receiver attached to Baker Mayfield. None of that's very appealing, and his 11 fantasy points per game are not even really a wide receiver 3 type in fantasy. So it's just Evans, it's Rachaad White, it's consolidated. The Panthers are one of the most extreme, if not the most extreme, run funnel defenses for fantasy. Quarterbacks, it's the worst matchup for fantasy points. Quarterbacks average 4 fewer fantasy points a game against the Panthers than their season-long averages. But running backs against them average 5.5 more fantasy points, which is 3rd best. So we can start Rachaad White like we do each week. And I have zero interest in Baker as a streaming quarterback, since that's always the question each week for people that have been rotating quarterbacks, is that good matchup, Baker's going to give you 17 fantasy points. Bad matchup, you're looking at 10 to 12. I think this can be thrown in the bad matchup category, where the Panthers just simply can't get anything going on offense, and teams have no need to pass against them.
Yeah, I mean, like we just mentioned, they fired Frank Reich. They fired Josh McCown. Sometimes this can be a good thing. We saw with the Raiders with Antonio Pierce. They're 2-2 with Pierce, but they gave Miami and the Chiefs games. I have my doubts here because struggling rookie quarterback, new offense, almost a whole new coaching staff on the fly late in the season, and now you're getting a Todd Bowles defense on the other side of things. Is there any optimism here for the Carolina Panthers, short or long term, Josh?
I have no optimism. I know that everyone out there is going to be excited about Bryce Young because just maybe the Buccaneers have struggled against quarterbacks. I think the Panthers are one of the few offenses where, just like how there's some players like Christian McCaffrey where the matchup doesn't matter, you just start him in fantasy as the RB1. I think the Panthers offense is one of those where, regardless of matchup, we're just not starting these players in fantasy football. Chuba Hubbard did have slightly more usage than Sanders this past week. It was not quite the 50-50 committee. He did get there in fantasy, but against the Buccaneers team that's generally shut down running backs, I just simply have no interest. I think Adam Thielen is the one player where I would say regardless of your fantasy lineup, you're probably starting him. And I think we can just stop at that name.
I like it, Josh. I like it. I did not like the Patriots offense last week, Josh. Patriots versus Chargers this week. Patriots are 6-point home underdogs, 40.5 game total here. I don't think I've ever seen a worse half of football from a quarterback than I saw from Mac Jones last week. Maybe the Nathan Peterman game, but shockingly bad. He threw his second interception was just, I still don't know what was going on there. Bailey Zappi came in, they orchestrated a scoring drive, but he really wasn't much better. It's why these guys are flip-flopping quarterbacks so often is because they don't really have a solution with either of them. That said, Josh, best I've seen Ramondre Stevenson look all season. He was a difference maker last week in a very otherwise, unenthusiastic offense. What are we thinking with the Patriots here, Josh?
Yeah, my only note is that we can start Ramondre Stevenson. They not just a big fantasy day, but the usage day was huge as well. Outsnapping Zeke nearly 4-1, out carrying him 21-9. Zeke remains relatively efficient most weeks, but that doesn't really matter when Ramondre is just getting so much more usage. And Demario Douglas, I believe, is in the concussion protocol. And oh boy, if there was ever a team not equipped to take advantage of the Chargers pass defense, it would be the Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi quarterback committee. When, what is it going to be? Devontae Parker, Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyquan Thornton as your 3 starting receivers. I think this is probably a pretty good bounce back spot for the Chargers.
Yeah, I'm going to say this. I was probably the first person in our space to say negative things about Brandon Staley. Came in his first year when they played the Eagles. I took the Chargers in that game. The Eagles just ran the ball down their throat, and Staley did not adjust, and that's just kind of the deal with him. I'm also not a super zealot when it comes to going on and on fourth down. I think he's cost his team some games in the past. That said, Josh, they just shut down Lamar Jackson. So I don't think this is the week to fire him if you're going to do it. That doesn't make any sense to me. This might actually be the last year's game against the Dolphins or last week's game defensively might be the 2 best jobs he's done as a Charger. One thing I have concern with here, Josh, is Austin Eckler does not look like a difference maker currently. He does not look like himself. I don't know if it's injury related. I don't know if it's age related. I don't know what's going on. Have you noticed the same thing?
Yes, I have. I think when you just watch him on film, he looks slower. There have been a few plays where you watch him go to the outside and you think this is a first down. And then you look and you go, oh, it's somehow 2nd and 5 where he had the big hole. And that's pretty concerning because he's not going to get a ton of carries, so he has to make the most of them. And then the other thing is his big plays in the passing game are also going to be reduced, where even if he's running some routes that are similar to a slot receiver, if he's not going to be making guys miss and he's not going to be able to break off those big plays, then I'm not really sure what we're looking at. In some ways, at times he's been like the worst version of Rachaad White with some of his explosiveness in his role. And that is not a compliment to someone that people spent a first-round fantasy pick on. The one other note I'll say is that Keenan Allen just continues to turn back the clock. 31 years old, 16 targets now in back-to-back weeks, 39% target share against the Ravens. I do not care what the matchup is. Keenan Allen, if you're not ranking him as a top 5 fantasy receiver, I don't know what you're doing each and every week.
Guy's having a career year at 31, man. It's incredible. It's awesome.
I've been as a Chargers fan, we needed a bright spot. This is apparently for fantasy football. This is the bright spot is Keenan Allen. His contract looks awesome. So we have something.
Next up, Titans versus Colts. Titans are 2-point home underdogs. Game total here is 43 points. On the Titans side of things, Josh, low upside offense. Will Levis has shown some promise, but he's inconsistent. I think you're looking at a Daniel Jones type situation here where even in the best case scenario, I think the possibility of him turning into a top 10 quarterback is very small, very narrow. What have you noticed with the Titans offense, Josh?
Before touching on their offense as a whole, a lot of people out there did not like my Will Levis thread that went viral because after his historic first start, I kind of discussed a few reasons for concern. Sure enough, he's been terrible in fantasy since then. He's been pretty terrible in real life. It's now 3 straight games below 200 passing yards, 4 straight games under 15 fantasy points. I'm not going to say I told you so, folks, but I might have told you so. And if you want more film analysis, Ryan's the guy to do it. Ryan has watched every snap of every game since 2014. He lives to tell about it. He's got his survivor picks up on the site, the33rd-team.com on Mondays, his power rankings on Tuesdays, expert picks and predictions on Thursdays, and what he's betting on in each game on Saturdays. He's a busy, busy man. All of his content is worth consuming. Going back to the Texans, the one positive is you talked about it a little bit. The big dog, Derrick Henry, great game. 18 carries, 76 yards, 2 touchdowns against the Panthers. And the Colts just allowed Rachaad White to have the 100-yard day. We talked about how that was on a big play. I think Derrick Henry could have some big plays in store for him. Colts giving up the 5th most adjusted fantasy points based on schedule to running backs this year. We are going to be starting the big dog fairly confidently again this week in what I think is probably going to be a fairly close contest.
Probably the biggest surprise of the season for me and probably many others is this Colts team would make the playoffs right now, which means, in my opinion, Sean Steichen would be the coach of the year today if the season ended. They have a manageable schedule going forward, but the one thing I want to ask you about, Josh, is last week was a tough matchup for the running game. Jonathan Taylor still hit. He looks like a league winner right now. You've talked about it a few times when we've discussed, rest of season rankings, playoff schedule. What are we thinking long-term here with Taylor?
Yeah, he looks like we've got Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara. I don't know who number 3 is. It might be Jonathan Taylor. And we've been talking about this for weeks now where we said, guys, do you really think they just extended him to have him in a 55-45 committee with Zach Moss long-term? Sure enough, Jonathan Taylor's just been awesome. The Buccaneers have now allowed 2 rushing touchdowns to running backs this season. Both of them came against Jonathan Taylor this past week. I think he's matchup proof. He looks like he's back. He's fully healthy. The role is awesome. And one thing I'll add about the Colts, I was wrong on them. I bet on them to have the worst record in football at 11-1 odds this offseason. And not only are they making me look silly with their record, but they're doing it with Gardner Minshew, a backup quarterback. It's simply been incredible. So I agree. I don't know how Shane Steichen doesn't win Coach of the Year if I'm an awards voter. Unfortunately, we do not get a vote. We cannot laud him other than this podcast. So props to you. This Colts team has been not just feisty, but actually consistently pretty good week in, week out.
Definitely. Next up, Eagles versus 49ers. The Eagles are actually 2.5-point home underdogs. 1 point underdogs yesterday. I think some of that's due to injury. They also played an overtime game, but that's one of those lines where it looks wrong, but I actually like the wrong side. I'll take the 49ers or pass here. Game totals 47 points. My biggest stance in betting last week was I thought Buffalo was going to cover at 3.5 and probably win. I was heavy on the winner pools too. That obviously aged well. They went to overtime. That was a coin flip game. But from the Eagles side of things, the Eagles, I would say, let's say this, Josh. We talk about this all the time for 2 years now. The Eagles have one of, if not the best roster in the league. I think they're a 9 and what are they, 10-1 now? They kind of haven't reached their peak yet. Like they've been good, but I don't think they've really had a lot of ceiling this season for their roster. But how they came back in that game is very encouraging for their future prospects. What do you think about Philadelphia's offense, Josh?
Yeah, I think one thing that's cool too is that Jalen Hurts is very self-aware of this. When he was interviewed after their week 11 game 2 weeks ago, he talked about how, yes, it was a good win. It was a good team victory, but he discussed some of the mistakes they made on offense and how ultimately he's so excited about this team because he said, if you look at our games, we haven't actually put it together yet. And every single week I'm left thinking about what I could have done. And I think that's just a very, very encouraging sign for Eagles fans, for fantasy football. I'm going to be monitoring if right tackle Lane Johnson, who missed week 12 at the last second with a groin injury, if he suits up, that's going to be a pretty big difference maker when you're facing the Niners. And one other thing that we can take a little victory spin on is Devonta Smith. We talked about how Dallas Goedert's injury would be good for Devonta Smith, just further consolidating an offense that we know is explosive and high scoring. And Devonta Smith's 2 games now without Dallas Goedert were 6 catches for 99 yards and 7 catches for 106 yards and a touchdown. Devonta Smith looks like a low-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy without Dallas Goedert, which is basically what we were suggesting would be the case. Are you concerned here, though, about should Lane Johnson miss? Because you're the one that watches every snap. You're the one who looks at these line disparities. And I know that for me, I am monitoring this. So how big is this for factoring everything in?
I actually think that's why the line moved, against this opponent with Chase Young and Nick Bosa. The Eagles traditionally, I don't have the stats on hand right now, but they're much less effective on offense when he misses games. Like there's like a legitimate drop off. And, that's because offensive line play provides stability. And him and Kelsey are their linchpins in that group. And against this specific pass rush, I think that's going to end up being the difference in this game. My power rankings will come out tomorrow. I'll have the Eagles first because they only have one loss, but I think the 49ers are the best, most complete team in the league. They have so many ways they can beat you. And then when you throw this Lane Johnson thing on top of it, where these are probably the two best pass rushes in the league, where the 49ers, you can get them in certain areas too, especially in the interior. So a big game for Jalen Carter potentially. And, again, on Bosa's side, not only do they have Young and Bosa, but you have Drake Jackson, who's a relevant player. You have Gregory, they have great depth at defensive end. That's going to be, I think, the margin in this game. And one more thing, Josh, before I ask you about your thoughts here. If Brock Purdy wins this game, I'm going to be very curious to see if he runs to the front of the MVP race. Jalen Hurts is there right now, primarily because of team record. Brock Purdy's first in a number of relevant categories. If you like semi-long shots, look at Purdy in the MVP market if you think the 49ers are going to win this game. What do you like here, Josh?
Yeah, I think this could be a really big game for Brock Purdy and company. The Eagles are the third best matchup for quarterbacks in fantasy points, the second best adjusted matchup for wide receivers in fantasy points. They've been the strictest run defense in terms of limiting running back fantasy points, but it's Christian McCaffrey that doesn't matter. So I think the Niners offense is actually very well suited to exploit the Eagles in a secondary that just hasn't been nearly as effective as last season. So I'm with you. At first, I thought it was surprising to see the Eagles as 2.5-point underdogs at home. And then as I started digging more, I thought, you know what? I think there's more paths to victory for the Niners in this one as well. So I'm leaning Niners 2.5.
I'm not a huge revenge narrative guy, but in certain situations I am. Like when the Eagles played the Chiefs, I thought when you lose the Super Bowl to someone by a hair, you want it more than them the next time. I think the 49ers, based on how the NFC Championship game went, they're not going to treat this like a normal game either. Next up, Josh. One more thing, Josh. I don't know how this isn't Sunday Night Football. That makes no sense to me. Let's fire AI.
Yeah, AI continues. Not only did they have the Packers-Lions 2 times on Thursday, we've had a litany of terrible island games. And yeah, I think this is another one where I go, Eagles-Niners. Currently the 2 best teams in football.
Yeah.
Playing when several other teams are playing football.
Yeah, it's not like it's not like it's a surprise either. They literally played in the NFC Championship game last year. To go from the best game on the slate, Rams, Browns, my expert picks come out on Thursday morning. This is the game I'm going to hate the most when I do those. Rams -4.5. Maybe the line that surprised me the most this season is this one. 39.5-point game total. Rams offense looked awesome against the Cardinals last week. Kyren Williams, shout out to our waiver guy, Nick Boniford. He liked them last year, never wavered. I don't think anyone was more on Kyren Williams than Nick. Stafford made a wonderful throw last week to Tutu Atwell in the game, dropping down the sideline. I mentioned that because the week before, it looked like his hand was still bothering him. That was a throw that, there aren't 10 people on the planet that make that throw with any consistency. Stafford, one of them. I am very concerned about the Browns' defense against this team, though, Josh. But what are you thinking about the Rams' offense in general, especially because they're kind of a shootout companion, and we've thought that all season.
Yeah, we've kind of discussed how their defense just doesn't have many good pieces outside of Aaron Donald, and how the offense is headlined by Matthew Stafford. Browns defense has struggled for a few weeks now. I think the Rams can have a pretty big day overall offensively, but in terms of a shootout, it's really difficult to see that happening. Dorian Thompson-Robinson was concussed this past week. PJ Walker came in and performed noticeably worse.
Yeah.
Maybe we see Joe Flacco get elevated and draw the start here. I think if I was managing the Browns, that's what I would do after what we've seen from PJ Walker, what we know he is after nearly half a decade of him bouncing around the NFL, XFL. So I think that's going to be a big one. I think Flacco gives this game a little bit more hope for fantasy enthusiasts. The one thing that I'm pretty certain of is that Kyren Williams just has the ridiculous role. I have an expected fantasy points model based on usage. And we have Christian McCaffrey, and we have Alvin Kamara. And then number 3 by a decent margin is Kyren Williams. It's not Austin Eckler. It is not Tony Pollard. It's not Joe Mixon. It's not Josh Jacobs. Just based on usage, it's actually Kyren Williams, which gave me a little bit of a surprise. The guy's just been absolutely awesome with his role. He was supposed to be eased in this past week. So to ease him in, Sean McVay gave him 16 carries. He turned those into 143 yards on the ground. And then he was targeted 6 times and caught all 6 for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think after McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara, I think I'd go Jonathan Taylor. And then after that, I think Bijan Robinson and Kyron Williams might be fighting at this point for who the next tastiest running back is rest of season in fantasy football.
I love that because I would have never thought that entering the season that would even be a conversation. I don't think most people would either. Maybe Nick's the only one. Now, Cleveland's defense can win this game on their own. They've won most of their games this season on their own for the most part. I agree with you. I actually think Joe Flacco, he couldn't fix most situations, but he can score 13, 16 points. And for this, without turning it over a lot, I think he could make it work here with that, which is, crazy to say. I think he's actually the best option they have because, like with you, PJ Walker is one of my least favorite players in the league to watch. Jerome Ford's fast. He's impressive. He's not consistent at all, but when he gets a hole, he's a bit like Ronald Jones. If you give this guy a hole, he's gonna get you margin. Creating his ability to create's a little dicey, but is there anything you have to say that's even mildly enthusiastic about the Browns offense, Josh?
Yeah, just like last week, it's still David Njoku. We just keep racking up the total. We're at 6 straight games of double-digit fantasy points, 6 straight games with a target share of at least 21%. If Joe Flacco becomes the 4th quarterback to start for them in this month, I think that might be fine for only David Njoku. When you adjust for schedule, Rams are the 4th best matchup for fantasy tight ends. And I think just with the state of this quarterback room, we can't really trust Amari Cooper. It's really just Jerome Ford in the run game and then David Njoku in the pass game that are fantasy viable at this point.
Sunday Night Football, Josh, we mentioned this before, Packers versus Chiefs. I think I thought Aaron Rodgers was still a Packer. That's why we're here. Spreads, Packers 6.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 42.5. Jordan Love's an interesting conversation to me because he's not bad. He's not a great quarterback. I'm not sure he's the guy you want to marry. But he's not bad. He showed a ceiling game last week against the Lions. This offense has not been very consistent all year, though. So I think expecting that to be the new norm is ambitious. Spencer gets a Chiefs defense that's been in the top 5 all year, pretty much. What do you think about Love and the Packers here, Josh?
Yeah, I think his streak of 3 pretty excellent games ends this week against the Chiefs. But I think going forward, Jaden Reed continues to surge. Christian Watson had a really good game this past week. Romeo Doubs, his yards per route run has been significantly lower than Jaden Reed and Christian Watson this year, with Luke Musgrave, their rookie tight end, on injured reserve and probably just missing the rest of this season, at least for fantasy football. Watson and Reed, outside of pretty horrific matchups like the Chiefs, should both be startable in fantasy. But this week, I really just have not much interest. I think this is kind of a similar matchup we talked about earlier where we're like, Zach Charbonnet is going to get all the touches, but does that matter against Dallas? A.J. Dillon's going to get all the touches, but does that really matter when you're facing the Chiefs? And game script's going to most certainly not be in your favor. I'll have my fantasy rankings out tomorrow. I'm not quite sure if there's going to be any Packers in any top 24 categories across the board this week.
I know with that Dillon question, Josh, I don't have him in season long this year at all. That would be a horrifying question to contemplate this year because I'd lean towards sitting him in most situations, but you may be stuck. The Chiefs, Josh, gave me an early sweat in Survivor. The Raiders jumped out to a 14-0 lead. Kansas City stormed back 131-17. That's what championship teams do. Song remains the same here, though, Josh. Patrick Mahomes is the best player in the league. His supporting cast is, his offensive line stable, very good. Isaiah Pacheco is a good player. Travis Kelce's Travis Kelce. Everyone else is at least unreliable with maybe one guy who has an interesting ceiling. What do you think about Kansas City's offense, Josh?
Yeah, this was the big Rashee Rice breakout game. I thought the best thing that he showed was actually the run after catch ability. I didn't think I saw anything too impressive outside of this is a big, fast player who can make guys miss after the catch. And with Patrick Mahomes, that's at least interesting. But to your point about the inconsistency, Rashee Rice did have 10 targets. He caught 8 for 107 yards and a touchdown. This was the first time all season a Chiefs receiver hit 85 yards in a game. It has basically just been Travis Kelce and some kind of rotation. It's crazy to think that Patrick Mahomes hasn't been able to will a receiver in this offense to 85 or more yards until week 12, but that's kind of where we're at. The last thing is that I think should Jerick McKinnon miss this week again, he was practicing last week and then didn't practice on Friday due to a groin injury, and then he missed the game. That usually means a multi-week absence if they get hurt kind of at the end of the practice week. Should he miss again? Green Bay is kind of a run funnel defense. I think Pacheco could be in for a massive, massive day on the ground. He just had 2 touchdowns on 15 carries and caught all 5 of his targets for 34 yards. Clyde Edwards-Helaire literally inherited none of the Jerick McKinnon pass game work. It is clear that this was one of the worst draft picks of all time. This is a guy that even when he's the backup pass catching back, they still don't want him to be a pass catching back. And they said, we'll give you a couple carries, but we actually want the 7th round rookie who was not a pass catcher in college to take on that role. So Pacheco, I think, should get pretty much all the touches once again if McKinnon misses.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't make it work with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, you might want to consider a career change. Monday Night Football, Jaguars versus Bengals. The Jaguars were 7.5-point favorites yesterday. They're already 8.5-point favorites now. Game total here is 39 points. I know the big decision for me in Survivor this week, Josh, is do I take Jacksonville this week and not have them for Week 17 against the Panthers, and where I have to use someone more volatile like the Steelers or maybe the Buccaneers because of the teams I have left? Or I think the Jaguars are the safest team on the board this week, so that's a big decision for me. Right about that later in the week. Trevor Lawrence was a few inches away from having on 2 throws from having a monster game against the Texans. Pass rush for Jacksonville showed up in big moments against Houston. One thing I'll say here is one of the things that's impressive about CJ Stroud is when teams go up on them by more than a score, he's pretty good at responding back. Trevor Lawrence showed that in this game too. When Houston scored, he came back and orchestrated a scoring drive. I think that could be one of the league's best rivalries over the next 10 years. But in this matchup, Josh, you have any enthusiasm for anything?
Honestly, not much. We will give credit to AI. They did not know Joe Burrow would be out for the season at this point. So we've been robbed of Burrow-Lawrence. The Jaguars have been a bit of a pass funnel defense. I don't think that matters. It's Jake Browning. To his credit, he completed 73% of his passes at 8.5 yards per attempt. 227 total yards. That's not terrible. Threw a touchdown, threw an interception, took 4 sacks. Unfortunately for fantasy, he did not lock on to Jamar Chase like we'd hope. So with inferior quarterback play, you're generally hoping that at least the top target is just getting all the looks. Jamar Chase just had a 24% target share this past week. He caught 4 of 6 for 81 yards. We don't hate that fantasy stat line of 12 fantasy points, but going forward, that's really not what you want. If he's going to have that low of volume, do I expect Jamar Chase to have 20 yards per reception each and every week with Jake Browning? Definitely not.
My second favorite game last week was the Steelers, and I pick them over the Bengals for this reason, Josh. This team reminds me of when Peyton Manning missed the season. Everyone's like, oh, the Colts will be fine. This team is not fine without Joe Burrow. 0. The defense is not good enough to hold up. Jake Browning, maybe if they had Gardner Minshew, they could hang. But with Jake Browning, I have 0 confidence. Do you think they have any shot here against the Jaguars?
I do not know. I think the Jaguars are starting to roll, and the Bengals defense in general hasn't been very good this year. I think they've been helped at times by this offense and Joe Burrow, once his calf got healthy, keeping the defense off the field, letting them rest. I don't think that's the case anymore. And I will say, folks, I think this is Evan Engram touchdown week. He's pacing for 99 receptions this year. He has not scored yet. Bengals are the worst defense when facing fantasy tight ends. I think this could be Engram's big day. And then in terms of we have some hot water now for the cold water moment. I'm still not sold on Calvin Ridley. We've had 2 big games the past 2 weeks, but Evan Engram and Christian Kirk both out-targeted him against the Texans. And while the Bengals defense doesn't look great, it's hard for me to imagine enough pass volume there for someone that looks like the 3rd option most weeks in this pass attack to be able to get there for fantasy purposes. And folks, we have now gone through every single week 13 game, previewing them. Stay tuned later in the week. Ryan and I have much more content coming out on the33rdteam.com. Ryan is at Ryan Reynolds NFL on the Twitter and X universe. You can find me at JLarkyTweets. From the 2 of us, from the 33rd team, from week 13, NFL action coming up shortly. Thank you, everyone.